Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Welcome to the panel, A Data-Driven Approach to Mapping Conspiracies. We are joined by our panelists this evening. We have Logan Williams. Logan is Bellingcat's data scientist and developer. He assists researchers with data analysis, creates data visualizations for public research, and is involved in scoping, designing, and building Bellingcat's technical initiatives. Joined by Logan is his colleague, Tristan Lee. Tristan is a data scientist at Bellingcat, whose work focuses on far-right and conspiracy theory networks online. And then from the Lighthouse Reports side, we have Justin, Casimir Braun. Justin is a data fellow, and he is a data journalist who focuses on the societal impact of automated systems and artificial intelligence. And then finally, we have Florian Renard. Florian is a cybersecurity reporter working with Le Monde, with Pixels and the team covering cyber and the broader digital culture inside the newspaper. And what we're going to be covering today is how the dashboard works. This will be your first taste of how you can use the dashboard, and basically each member of the team is going to walk you through a little bit deeper about the potential of the database and how you can use it in your own investigations. So first, we'll turn it over to Logan to give us some context and a big overview of the database.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Logan. I'm a data scientist at Bellingcat, and I'm going to kick us off with a dive into the QAnon database that Bellingcat and Lighthouse Reports have been building together for the past year or so as part of this QAnon in Europe project. So if you've been following along over the past 2 days, you may have heard a little bit about the database already, especially if you listened to Ava's great talk immediately before this. But essentially, we're tracking a large number of far radical, conspiratorial, or QAnon-related social media channels across the internet, collecting the media that they share, the posts they make, and putting them in a format where researchers can find specific posts, search for keywords, analyze trends, and look at how these communities have grown or changed over time. If you go to qanon.bellingcat.com, you can access a splash page with a little more information about the database, as well as a link where you can apply for access yourself to use the database. So essentially, what powers the database is a multi-platform post and media scraper or archiver. So essentially, we have these social media platforms that are out there, like Telegram, Gitter, YouTube, Gab, or some of the ones that we're scraping. And they have posts and they have media on their services. We collect that through a process called scraping and store all of the raw data of those posts, as well as the media, in a database. We then do some processing and data cleaning on that database to achieve a cleaned data set. And we've also built a data access dashboard for accessing that data set that I'll demonstrate in the next few minutes. In the database, we have about 2,500 channels in total. About half of those were collected by researchers doing their own research into how these radical conspiracy communities have grown in the countries of their research area. And another half were collected through a process called snowball sampling, led by Lighthouse Reports, where we found channels that these initial researcher collected channels had interacted with quite heavily, and we added those channels to the data set as well. From these channels, we have over 34 million posts that have been scraped, archived, and are now searchable. There's 42 different languages in the data set that those posts have been made in, which is significantly more than the number of countries that were initially targeted, and nearly 4.5 million images that have been archived and OCR'd, like Ava talked about in her talk, as well as nearly 1.5 million videos that have been archived. Some of them are hours long. So all of this content is a little overwhelming, and that made it really important to develop tools for search and access that researchers could use. And that's where the dashboard comes in that I'll demonstrate for the next few minutes. In the researcher dashboard, you can start with a look at the channels that have been archived. Here in this table, we can see a listing of all of the channels. There's 2,100 that have data that we can sort through. We can look by attributes like channels that have gained a lot of new followers recently, or channels that have the most followers overall, which will display a list of some familiar influencer names. We can also search this table. For instance, if we search for NL, we'll find channels that have the country tag NL or NL in their name. So now we're seeing mainly Dutch channels. Clicking on one of these channels shows more detail, such as the description of the channel on Telegram, as well as a graph of the followers over time. And if we look at this channel in particular, we can see that something happened in early July that led to a significant increase in the number of followers. Clicking on that graph at a date takes us to a listing of the posts that that channel made in early July. And as the media loads, we can see that this Dutch channel was mainly talking about the Dutch farmer protests, which were a significant media event at the time. And that probably explains the growth in followers. They must have noticed that too, because you can see interspersed in here as well, there's a post about fundraising with some links to some Bitcoin addresses for raising cryptocurrency funds. And this particular post we can see was viewed nearly 20,000 times at the time that it was scraped. Because this is all in a web browser, a researcher is also able to use Google's Chrome's built-in features if they're in Chrome to translate it automatically into another language, which can be useful to researchers. Of course, we also have the ability to search for particular terms or keywords in the database, as well as search by date, language, or country. We can do a simple search to demonstrate, for instance, looking for Meloni to find references to Giorgia Meloni, the right-wing prime minister of Italy who was recently elected. And then a researcher could scroll through and read posts to see how this topic is being discussed among the QAnon and conspiratorial world. Some of these posts are forwarded from other sources. Those ones are kind of highlighted in this gray box here. And if we look at one of these forwarded posts, we can also compare this or refine the search by looking for a particular language. In this case, we've updated the, sorry about this, I'm losing track of my video. In this case, we've updated the search query so that now we're only looking for post languages in Italian. And when we do that, the search will rerun and we will only see Italian language posts. In the post statistics view, we can see a graph of the number of posts that match this query over time. And here we can see that while there was some talk among these QAnon channels about Meloni prior to her election, it was in late 2022 when it really took off. We can also see the number of posts by each channel over time. And we can add additional queries to compare the number of posts over time for different search variations. For instance, we could look for every language except Italian to see how non-Italian channels use the Meloni keyword. And here we can see an interesting and expected pattern that there was more discussion of Meloni among Italian language channels prior to her election, and then after her victory, it increased dramatically in non-Italian channels before rapidly subsiding. Ava mentioned the ability to search media, and I think that's a really interesting part of our database. If you adjust the search parameters to look for a media keyword, you can search for keywords that appear in images that have been OCR'd automatically to recognize text in that image. Here I've searched for gematria, which is a kind of numerology that's popular in certain QAnon and conspiracy subcultures. And a lot of these posts are simply images that are shared that don't include any text at all. So this wouldn't appear if you just looked in the post text. And of course, you can see statistics for these image frequencies over time as well. And there's really quite a lot of these that are shared. You can also look for particular keywords, like, of course, where we grow one, we go all, to find Q drops as well as memes that are shared among the community. And see various financial scams, for instance, that are shared with this with images containing this keyword. That was the Q coin. Scroll down, can find some more. Yeah, there's the Trump bucks, of course. And if we wanted to find out more about these particular things that we'd found, you can use, for instance, quotes to search for an exact phrase, or this pipe character to do an or and find things that contain any one of these phrases. And now we can isolate our search to certain financial scams. And then, of course, if we're interested in what channels are most responsible for sharing this kind of content, we can get that from the post statistics view. And of course, all of the data here is exportable as a CSV for researchers to make their own analyses or do graphs offline. So I mentioned at the beginning that we're also storing all of that raw data as well as the process data in the dashboard. And the reason for that is that it can be useful for researchers and data scientists, especially, to find information that might not be present across all channels or across all platforms. So it's difficult to include in a multi-platform dashboard. For instance, this is a SQL or structured query language query that tries to find why Telegram channels specifically have been banned from Telegram. And here are the most common reasons why Telegram channels have been banned in the QAnon dataset. You can see there's some terms of service violations. And then down here, this one's kind of interesting. This channel can't be displayed because it violated local laws. Using the raw data, we can look in more detail at that and find out why that might be the case. And the channels that have been banned for that reason, it looks like, are Russia Today and Sputnik. So this must be how Telegram is responding to the EU sanction control on Russian media. Now, finally, we've also built in some tools in the dashboard for understanding how these channels relate to each other in the full QAnon ecosystem. We saw this briefly when we looked at forwarded post earlier, that we can see some statistics about post forwarding. In this case, this post from at US Navy official, probably not the US Navy's official Telegram account, is the 29 most common source of posts forwarded to this German account, "The storm is upon us." And if you want to see how the storm is upon us gets its information, we can load up a network graph like that, which my colleague Tristan will now explore in much more detail.
Thanks, Logan. I'll hand it over to Tristan.
Can you guys hear me? Great. Yep, so I'm going to be talking about network visualizations and what they can tell us about the structure of these conspiracy communities. So let's take a step back. What is a network? So a network consists of what we call nodes and edges, also known as vertices and links. In general, nodes are some kind of object, and edges are the connections between nodes. So that's pretty abstract. So here are some more concrete examples. The nodes could be karate students, and edges are friendships between students. The nodes could be characters in a book. Edges are when both characters appear in the same book chapter. For example, the book could be Les Miserables, this common network dataset. Or what might be more familiar to some of you, nodes could be Twitter accounts, and edges are when one account likes or retweets a tweet from another account. This example is a network of West Papuan propaganda networks on Twitter made as part of a Bellingcat investigation. So how are networks visualized? In general, what we want to do is pretty simple. We want to assign each node a position in 2 dimensions. And the rules we want to follow are that we want nodes with a lot of edges between them to be close together, and we want nodes without edges between them to be far away from each other. We can adjust the size of each node based on its properties. So for example, in a Twitter network, we might want to make each node size related to the number of followers an account has. And we can also adjust, for visualization purposes, we can adjust the color of each node based on some of its properties. I'll talk a bit more about that later. So as Logan mentioned, the dashboard has a network page that allows you to visualize the forwarding community around a specified channel. So basically what we're doing is finding all channels that are within 2 forwards of the selected channel. So you select a channel, and then it finds the channels they forwarded the most, and then channels that forwarded them the most. And then for all those found channels, we do the same thing. It finds the channels they forwarded the most and the channels that forwarded them the most. So in these networks, the nodes are channels, and the edges are when one channel has forwarded 1 or more posts from the other channel. The node size is related to the number of followers the channel has, the cube root of the number of followers to be specific, and edge thickness is related to the number of forwarded posts between the 2 channels. And nodes can be colored by language, country, or category. So let's try this live. So we go to the network tab, we select a channel, and it starts populating the network diagram. So you can see the selected node or the selected channel, which is QAnon fighters. Its position is fixed to the center, and it has a ring around it to distinguish it. And if you hover your mouse over any of these circles, it tells you some information about the channel, and it highlights the nodes and edges that are connected to it. And what you can do is if there's a node you're interested in, for example, hey, this one seems to have a lot of connections, you can click on it, and it makes that channel the selected channel, and it starts building the network around that. So yeah, and you can change the node coloring based on the and right now it's auto colored by language, but you can also change it by category or by the channel country. Or if you don't want to color it, you can just make them all black. All right, so let's talk a bit about some of these global. So basically, in addition to the dynamic forward network visualization graphs that I just showed, the dashboard also has 3 visualizations that look at the database as a whole rather than just a few channels. These visualizations are quite large, so the node positions have been pre-computed. So these visualizations are 1, a network of Telegram channel forwards, 2, a network of English language named entities and posts, which I'll talk a bit more about later, and 3, a network of hashtags. So let's look at this some of these networks. So, all right. So here the nodes are channels, and edges between nodes are when one channel forwarded 1 or more posts from the other. Nodes are colored by the most common detected language in all the channel's posts, and the node size is related to the number of followers the channel has. So one really nice thing about this network is that the clusters of nodes are very tight and correspond closely with the channel languages. So for example, we have one big cluster in green for German language posts. We have one big cluster in orange for English. We have some undefined channels, which just means the language detection was unable to confidently predict the language of the channel's posts. We have Italian language in blue, and we have French language in pink. Similarly, we have some Dutch channels in green, and some other channels in tan, largely Russian, and a few Spanish. So there's a few interesting things about this graph. One is that the positions of the language clusters can tell us a lot about how the different language communities relate to each other. So you can see that the English language cluster is at the center of the visualization, and you can see it kind of acts as a hub that connects the different European languages. We can also see that, for example, the Dutch language cluster is very close to the English cluster, indicating that the two communities have a lot of overlap in the content and posts they share. One thing I found particularly interesting is that there are a few nodes positioned between communities that act as kind of key links between the different languages. So, for example, um, between the English and French language community clusters, you have this one really prominent node where you can see a lot of edges kind of converge and diverge there. So this John Spartan, where the O is a Q, obviously, um, uh, acts as to connect the two languages. Similarly, for German, we can see there's kind of this hammer news, and for Italian, there are a few, but the most prominent seems to be this info nesh. So I think the big takeaways from this particular visualization are that it's useful for seeing how language communities relate to each other, and that looking at bridge nodes between clusters can inform how content moves between communities and across borders, which is one of the research objectives that Ava mentioned in her previous presentation. So before we look at the next visualization, I want to talk a little bit about what a named entity is. So basically what we're doing is we're using some fancy machine learning algorithms to detect real world objects in a sentence. So for example, the sentence, George Soros funded Azov Battalion in Ukraine, based solely on the structure of the sentence, this algorithm can determine, hey, so George Soros is probably some kind of person, Azov Battalion is some kind of organization, and Ukraine is some kind of geopolitical entity, like a country. So that's a little bit about entities, so now I'll show you the entity visualization. So in this visualization, the nodes are these named entities, and edges between nodes are when one or more posts contains both entities. The node size is related to the number of posts the entity is mentioned in, and nodes are colored by a community detection algorithm, which basically tries to group similar nodes together based on their edges. So it can identify some clusters pretty well. For example, the largest, most prominent cluster is this big one in purple that coincidentally looks quite a bit like a Q. I swear I didn't actually do that on purpose. But you can see this is kind of like general US politics things. So you have things like Donald Trump, Joe Biden, you got the FBI. Another large cluster is what I've called kind of COVID conspiracy, like coronavirus things. So you have things like COVID, CDC, Anthony Fauci, and Bill Gates, obviously. One interesting thing is that you have this kind of blue cluster, US, and with some terms like Armed Forces of Ukraine, Mariupol, Azov, and also curiously enough, things like Earth Alliance and aliens. So what seems to be happening here is that there are some alien-related accounts that are posting a lot about Ukraine. So this kind of like shows how the clustering the kind of community detection algorithm can lead to some unexpected results that isn't always very clear in how to interpret it, but it can be interesting. And one thing in particular that I found interesting is that there's kind of a Jeffrey Epstein cluster, and Bill Clinton acts as a bridge node between the Jeffrey Epstein cluster and the US politics cluster. So the kind of structure of these entities makes sense and maps very nicely onto how they're thought about by these communities. So I think the takeaways for these kinds of visualizations is that it's really interesting to see how different topics and subcommunities relate to each other. And this kind of visualization can be useful for finding similar or related terms for investigation. And one thing I particularly liked is that you can use it to find kind of niche subcommunities in terms. So one term that I wasn't familiar with is something called Schumann resonance, which is apparently a geophysics phenomenon that's mentioned a lot in weather and geoengineering conspiracy theories. All right, so the final visualization we're going to look at is looks at hashtags. So I assume you guys know what hashtags are. And so the nodes are hashtags. The edges between nodes are when one or more posts contains both hashtags. And nodes are colored by the most common detected language of the posts that use the hashtag. All right, so you can see similarly German, got English, got French, and Italian, similarly colored. And you have kind of a few big German clusters. One of them is kind of focused on coronavirus things. So we have Corona, virus, World Economic Forum, and you have another that's kind of focused on kind of mainstream politics. So you have things like, Deutschland, mainstream media, Biden, and Trump. We're saying that these kind of English language hashtags are coded as German because we have more German language posts than English language posts in the database. So the most common language of these hashtags ends up being German. We also have a few English language clusters. You have kind of like Pizzagate and traditional conspiracies on one side. So you have kind of Pizzagate, Antifa, Satan. And then on the other side, you have kind of more QAnon related terms like, Great Awakening, Trust the Plan, Q Army. And one thing that's particularly interesting is that the BLM or Black Lives Matter hashtag kind of serves as a bridge between these two kind of community, these kind of conspiracy clusters. So I think the big takeaway for this kind of graph is that it's really useful for seeing how language communities relate to topic-based communities. All right, so I think that's about all I wanted to talk about. If you sign up for the dashboard yourself, you can explore these networks on your own. It's a surprisingly fun way to spend some time.
Thanks, Tristan. Logan and Tristan, you had very excellent complementary presentations, I think, with Logan kind of just at a introductory level, how much you can get and learn about specific people, specific channels, specific topics. If you're doing sort of a deep dive or feature reporting on a specific event. And then Tristan, I think it was really valuable to see if you take a step back and you want to start to understand the ecosystem itself and the relationships between these different people and groups, and how the conversation is flowing across the ecosystem. I think that's really valuable from a much more deeper dive. So that's kind of the introduction from Bellingcat to the database they built. Now we're going to switch to more the journalistic side of things. Justin is going to take you through the experience of working with journalists to help them pursue the investigations and shape the investigations that they wanted to pursue at a national level. And then Florian is going to walk you through what it was like to actually put together one of these investigations and pilot the database for us. So I'll hand it over to Justin.
Great. Thanks, Eva. And also thanks, Tristan and Logan. Let me just share my screen real quick. All right. And start the slideshow. Wonderful. So yeah, I will just kind of walk you through the kind of work that I did working together with Trouw, a Dutch newspaper, to investigate the Dutch farmers' protest movement and how it kind of became a global conspiracy theory. So that's kind of the final article. My plan here is to basically show you a very simple and straightforward example of how you can move from this database that has all these amazing resources, but at times might be somewhat overwhelming, to actually telling a story around particular events. So our general approach to data journalism within Lighthouse, but I think this is kind of a common process overall, is to really start out by clearly defining one's editorial goals, which in this case was to describe how local conflict about these Dutch farmer protests became a global conspiracy theory. To then address this editorial goal, we defined a couple of research questions which were more data-driven, which we could answer using the database, such as how many posts were there in Dutch with keywords that matched the Dutch farmer protests over time, how many posts were there in other languages such as English and German, and then what conspiracy theories are mentioned frequently in conjunction with Dutch farmers protests. So we again use some text mining and other keywords methods to find those other posts. And then we also defined some hypotheses. So we would actually know what we would find and how it would match with our expectations, so we could then, answer our research questions and address the editorial goals more directly. So in this case, our working hypothesis was that, a few Dutch channels were really important to this, and that they were instrumental in globalizing the Dutch farmers' protests, and brought it to the attention of major international kind of conspiracy figures like Donald Trump and Tucker Carlson. The first step for many investigations like this is to define keywords well. And on the right, you can kind of see the SQL type keywords that we used here. But basically, you have to clearly know which topic you're investigating. And at that point, you have to, you probably will start out with a single language, but as you kind of move to other languages, you have to make sure that your keywords, if you punch them into the database, that they return posts which are highly relevant to the topic that you're investigating. And that this relevance kind of holds across different languages as you're kind of adding keywords in other languages. This can be quite a tricky process, and there's some automated search term generation software to help with this. But basically, I think the easiest way to do this, and we're very lucky at Lighthouse and Bellingcat to have many, people who can talk very many different languages, is to just have people who have local expertise to help with this with the keyword generation. But it's also important to not just, punch this into the database and then just take the data that you get, but really double checking the returns that you get and whether they match the topical scope that you've defined. And the goal, of course, is to minimize the number of posts that don't match the topic that you're interested in, and to maximize the number of posts that do. Moving on, if you extract posts from the dashboard, you will get a ton of different variables, again, kind of along with the different types of raw data and process data that Logan has described. There is some metadata about the channel and the date and the URL of the post, and then there is the raw text of the post content. Then there is a number of derived variables, detected language, named entities, outlinks, crypto addresses, all these things that we've already discussed. And so starting with this, you really have to, try to answer your research questions on the basis of these data that you then have. A really basic one that the dashboard can also support itself, but you can also, work on this within R or Python or another process, or even Excel, is to just simply look at, how a topic how much topic was talked about over time. And then you can compare this across different languages. This is quite similar to what Logan has done within the dashboard. But it's also, very interesting at that point to then bring in key events from the outside world to compare with these dynamics. So in this case, we kind of compared it, to when a new proposal for Dutch farming regulations was made, which really led to a spike in Dutch conversations around this topic. And then, we looked at, there was a big speech by, there was a big interview on Tucker Carlson's show that dealt with these farmer protests. So we looked at how the conversation around Dutch farmers protests correlated with this conversation on Tucker Carlson's show. And we actually found that Tucker Carlson's show came after the biggest spike in discussion on this topic. So that kind of seems to indicate that Tucker Carlson was, driven more by Telegram than that he was driving Telegram. And similarly with Trump, he kind of, began to talk about this at the long tail of the conversation around this issue. Similarly, it makes sense to compare this over time. It makes sense to compare, compare this dynamic with key events. It makes sense to compare it across languages, and you can also do the comparison between, the most important channels. Once this ended up in Trau, it looked a lot prettier than what I have done with an R, but that is kind of the product that this led to. Other things to look into are links. Again, Logan and Tristan already discussed forwarding networks that you can look at within the dashboard. You can also, of course, do this manually on your own if you want to, use additional selection criteria, which the dashboard does not support. And what has been quite interesting for us has been to look into the outlinks. So basically, when a channel reposted links from, another website, news sites, other social media, and so on, because that really indicates that, these networks don't exist in isolation. They exist within a broader information ecosystem that they draw on. And you can kind of learn to discern how certain narratives were influenced conversations within these broader media ecosystems. So in this case, this is again for the Dutch farmers' protests. We see that a lot of these outlinks are to Telegram, to Twitter, to Rumble, so other social media platforms. but also some more mainstream news sites such as Welt.de, which is a German center-right newspaper, and then a bunch of fairly out there fringe newspapers such as Epoch Times and unsermitteleuropa.com, which I actually hadn't known before. And that can then also be an interesting thing to pivot to if you find these fringe sites that maybe haven't received much attention yet, to kind of see what they're posting, how they are interacting with the Telegram ecosystem. Another thing to look into if you have this, the raw content, is to, kind of try and find important issues that they talk about, kind of really try to understand what is going on. You might have an idea what the topic is and what the conversation is, but there's techniques to find out more about what they're talking about. Again, as Logan and Tristan have mentioned, named entities are a really good way to do that, and hashtags, they can give you an idea how, different topics might connect to one another within, the universe of posts that deals with the topic that you have defined at first. Another thing to do is to use more kind of keyword mining approaches, simply extracting all nouns. There's also more algorithmically defined high importance keywords using TF-IDF or rake. It's not so important what these algorithms are in themselves, but sometimes this is a good way to find important terms that come up within this the set of posts that you have extracted. In this case, actually, they didn't lead to super interesting results. I put them here just to kind of indicate that a lot of this is kind of trial and error, and some of these algorithms might not lead to super useful results, but I think it's always worth trying to just see if there's a narrative that you've missed, if there's an aspect that you've missed to the story that you're looking into. Moving on to content analysis. So of course you can simply read the post. There's a lot of interesting stuff in that. If there's tens of thousands of posts, it might make sense to use a random sample of the post to kind of see what is going on. Again, you can use keywords to kind of get a sense of what is happening. And there's fairly simple and straightforward ways to do sentiment analysis in R or in Python, or even some online tools are available for this, to kind of get a sense of how what the sentiment is around a certain topic. For instance, the Dutch farmer protests, are they talking about it in a positive way? Are they talking about it in a negative way? How does that maybe differ between different language contexts? And how does that change over time? Similarly, you could also do topic modeling or emotion modeling to kind of see, is it mostly a joyful, is it anger, is it regret, is it resentment that is kind of dominant in these conversations. Again, also those things might not necessarily be a story in themselves, but they might give you an indication for further things to look into, for additional kind of reporting angles to take on the story that you're investigating. One thing that was interesting to us, for instance, in the context of the Dutch farmer protest, was to what extent the Dutch farmer protests became or began to merge with other conspiracy theories. There's actually quite a lot of reporting already out there on the merger between kind of the freedom convoy narrative with the Dutch farmer protests narrative. And so we kind of looked at the number of posts that mentioned the freedom convoys within the universe of Dutch farmer protest posts. And we see that this actually differs a lot by language. So in German, you have very, very few posts that talk about the Dutch farmer protests and also the freedom convoys. But in English, French, and Italian, those really become merged narratives and kind of almost like a super conspiracy theory that includes both of them under their belt. And then in Dutch, it's kind of intermediate. It's about 1% of the posts. That kind of gives you an indication how this will also be interesting to look at over time to kind of see how the merging and shifting of conspiracy theories happen. But it kind of gives you an indication that as this Dutch farmer protests theory moved to the international ecosystem, it began to merge with the freedom convoy narrative within the English, French, and Italian Q ecosystem. These are just some basic ideas how you can approach the large set of data that you have, how you can connect it to the story that you're investigating. Just some best practices that have kind of emerged from the work that I've done in the last few months on this are that I think it's really key to clearly define research questions and connect them to the editorial objectives. I think it's really useful to have testable hypotheses. So you actually, don't just, have a random graph, but, the graph will actually answer a question that you had at the outset. A lot of these, there's a large toolbox of things that we can do. But a lot of them often don't lead to super useful results every time you try them. So, don't get stuck up on a particular method and just kind of pivot quickly if a certain approach doesn't yield results that are useful to your question. And then the data set is really large and some of the data, seems kind of messy at times. So I think it's always useful to kind of have this toy data set that you extract to kind of, play around with the different algorithms or the different visualizations that you attempt to make sure that, you really understand what is going on in your code and in your analyses. And finally, context really, really matters. So I think a lot of these data, visualizations and analysis approaches, they aren't super informative and meaningful in and of themselves, and they really become meaningful as you compare them to the real world, as you set them interaction with what is, what to be happening elsewhere. So I think the beginning I showed at the example I showed at the beginning around, how the post frequency correlated with real world events, I think that's a very simple way of doing that. But I think that general, constant comparison between what the data tells you and what to be happening in the real world, I think that is a really, useful approach to always, make what you're doing on the data relevant to your journalistic investigation. Yeah, that was kind of it from my side. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. That's really exciting about how a story gets made. So now we'll turn to Florian for the perspective for Lamont, and after that, we will be answering everyone's questions. So keep posting questions in the chat. Okay, go ahead. All yours, Florian.
Thank you. So I share my screen right now. So first off, I apologize for both my English and the fact that I'm not a data journalist. I have a chance to work with Justin and the team at Lighthouse who helped us with the hard and really difficult work of understanding the data and making sense in a much more researcher way of what we found. But what we at Le Monde try to do using the search engine and using the dashboard is trying to understand how, find a case study on how one theory can go from another country to France. Like, what's the itinerary? What's the how do we trace back a conspiracy theory, and when it's published in France, and how do we trace it back to the original poster? So we published our story a few weeks ago. It was designed around one big case study, the biolab theory, which a lot of you may know, and some of you even better than me here, especially at Bellingcat. And the idea was to find one big case study where we can trace back posts published in France and in Europe and see where it came from and where it was originally posted. And our research hypothesis was that a lot of these theories originated from the US first and the QAnon spheres in the US, and then trickled down into France and other countries in Europe, and which was the correct hypothesis. So for that, we first started with several different small theories. The first one being, for example, Dominion. So Dominion was a big thing in the US, and in 2022, as you may know, we had an election in France, and Dominion became a small topic, just a really small chatter, but it became some topic in the QAnon sphere and in some conspiracy theories sphere in the French-speaking internet. And it was a first good example of theories originating in the US, Dominion being a US-centric topic first, then being picked up by QAnon spheres in France, and then by the far right and some far right sphere connected to QAnon or not, still in France. Then we found a smaller case study, which is the case of Anne Heche, an American actress. She died this summer following a car crash and her injuries. But the interesting fact is that her death was used by the QAnon sphere in the US and a few QAnon accounts in the US as a proof that she was assassinated by the US authorities because she was going to reveal, of course, new information about the deep state and about satanic conspiracies and pedophile conspiracies in the US. So what you see, for example, on the screen maybe I'm talking too quick, sorry. What you see on the screen here is a screen cap of one of the biggest accounts on the French QAnon sphere, Alliance Humaine 2020. And we saw at least 100 posts like this on the dashboard. And what's interesting is that all these posts were using information from and videos from American QAnon accounts. For example, there was one video shared dozens of times by the French influencers, which originated from a TikTok account in the QAnon sphere in the US. So after that, we came onto the biggest case study for theory, which was the biolabs story. So you all know this one. We all looked for way too long at this map and had a lot of posts, and we did a lot of content analysis around the post containing this map, containing the keywords on biolabs. And the idea is that at the start of the war in Ukraine and the Russian military invasion in February, we started to see a lot of posts in French, but also in other languages, but mainly in French and in the French QAnon spheres. So we started to see a lot of posts alleging that Russia was actually invading Ukraine to destroy US biolabs, secret biolabs, making bioweapons or making COVID. It depends on where you look at the post in Ukraine. And but the real objective of the Russian army was to destroy these biolabs and these facilities. And this is an old talking point in the Russian media outlets. For example, in the first screenshot here, you can see an article in the Strategic Culture Foundation published in 2014. This particular outlet has been accused of being an SVR front by the US. And the second screenshot is related to the Cyber Berkut, which is a hacking group, alleged Ukrainian hacking group, which was also designated as a GRU front by the UK. So this is a long-standing Russian propaganda point. And the idea was to understand how it exploded into dozens and dozens and then hundreds of posts on February, even before the Russian media outlets and Russian official channels started talking about it. And what we found was one account called War Clandestine, and actually named Jacob Critch, which is at first a small-time QAnon influencer in the US, and who then started to post a lot about biolabs in Ukraine. And in our deleted Twitter account, he posted a Twitter thread on February 24th with a lot of tweets explaining that Russia was actually attacking Ukraine to destroy these US biolabs. And this thread was actually picked up, as you can see here, by a lot of influencers in France. And so our content analysis, thanks to the dashboard, showed us that this thread was either directly quoted or even sometimes translated by the biggest French influencers in the QAnon sphere, and then it spread all across QAnon in French and in France and other countries. But French was the biggest country in terms of the spread of this conspiracy theory. Sorry. So here, thanks to Lighthouse, we had an analysis on the language used in the post containing a post about the biolabs conspiracy theory. As you can see, English language is dominating, including French, but there is a caveat here which further explains our hypothesis, is that a lot of posts in French are actually translations and translations or even plagiarism of posts in English. So even the posts in English are actually in French are actually not original posts about biolabs, but posts from the US and English-speaking QAnon world translated by French influencers. What we haven't been able to do as of right now is to find how, and this is a work for later maybe, but find how it started in the US. This is just a final step, but we only found one source to this map, which is a Twitter account in January 24, sorry, and then January 28 on Gab, both on QAnon and various conspiracy theorist Twitter and Gab accounts. But we haven't been able to trace back how it ended up on War Clandestine's account. Sorry. I hope it wasn't too short. Sorry, I'm not a big public speaker. I hope it was understandable.
It was great, thank you. Okay, well, we hope that gave you guys everyone a broad overview of both what's in the database, how it works, and how you can use it yourself. We are going to do just a quick wrap up of what we were trying to accomplish with this talk, and then we're going to transition to questions. So the first thing, again, we wanted a walkthrough of what's in the dashboard, and I think one question we're going to get into a little bit more is how the data was collected. We also wanted to give you some use cases of how journalists have reported using the database, and how you might want to frame your research as you go into the database yourself. So to get started, we had a question from Jimmy Arturo Pais about what exactly is contained in the database. So whether it only applies to the Q space or it applies to the larger space. And to address that question, I think, Justin, can we turn to you a little bit about both what the sort of the origin of the database was, how we pulled the researchers pulled together the search term originally, and then how you expanded the database to be more representative of the QAnon space as a whole?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the question kind of points to a somewhat fundamental issue in doing this research, and that is that there is not really a thing such as the Q space, right? This is a very amorphous ecosystem that connects to many other conspiracy theories. It's even hard to, even define what is, QAnon and what isn't QAnon. I mean, the superpower, if you will, of that conspiracy theory is that it is incredibly good at ingesting other conspiracies, some of them very local. I mean, the Dutch farmers' protests are a great example of that. And then kind of makes it into this whole, moving monster that is QAnon, if you will, right? And so the origin of the database was really that country level researchers with Bellingcat and Lighthouse and others, put out a list of channels that they knew of, that they found, that they categorized according to whether they were explicitly QAnon or very adjacent conspiracy theories. That is still about half the database was collected in this way. The issue with that a little bit for drawing inferences about larger trends is that they were selected by people, and our concern was that it wouldn't really be reflective of a more representative picture of what is going on within that space being, of course, still relatively vaguely defined. So what we did in response to that is essentially we sampled, we essentially looked at the channels that were reposted frequently, reposted by many separate channels, and reposted across several different countries to kind of find other key players within this ecosystem that our initial system hadn't flagged. And we used a bunch of verification techniques, or robustness checks more like, to double check that, wherever we would kind of start in the network, we would end up at similar points. We would find the same channels. And our tests show that to be the case. So basically, we're fairly confident that, we got a good sample of the additional channels that hadn't been covered by the researchers through the snowball sampling approach. So now it should, cover a more representative picture of what is going on in that wider space. yeah, it is still, of course, it is always imperfect because the thing that we're looking at is so, moving so quickly and is so vague to begin with. But I think we should have a fairly good idea, if it shows up in our, if it doesn't show up in our database, it is quite unlikely. I think that it is a big thing within QAnon. But of course, it is never perfect. It's almost always impossible to, capture really everything.
And I know, Logan, you've been wrestling a lot with what to include or exclude in the database from the beginning. Can you talk a little bit about the decisions you made? And, somebody brought up topic modeling. There's a lot of directions the database could have got. So can you talk us through some of those decisions you made and how you think what you chose to include serves as entry points for people who are trying to research this space?
Sure. I think some of the kind of key differentiators between this project and previous projects we've seen for analyzing extremism on social media are we knew from the outset we really wanted to include media in this, the images and the videos that are being shared, because that visual culture is such an important part of the culture around QAnon, and as we've seen in some of the partner publications, a really important part of how topics and trends move around the ecosystem and even jump from one country or language region to another. Another key design consideration was we wanted to include these marginalized platforms like Gitter, Gab, Odyssey, among others, that have less attention and sometimes less technical tools available than more mainstream platforms like Twitter or Facebook, neither of which is actually in the database at all. And that was especially because we've seen a lot of QAnon influencers jumping from more mainstream platforms to these alternative platforms as platforms have taken a stricter line on conspiratorial channels and this kind of content. And those two design decisions led to developing a lot of our own tooling. Tristan made some scrapers for certain alternative platforms that we couldn't find good open source scrapers available for. And the media database at this point is now dozens of terabytes in size. Topic modeling was, I think, part of the question, and I saw it in the chat as well. And I think topic modeling would be a really great feature to include. It's something that we're working on. The scale starts to become an issue that there are solutions for, but it takes some time to develop. And also the fact that the database is still a living database. As we speak right now, more posts are being scraped and added to it. So we can't think of topic modeling as kind of a one and done thing that assigns categories and topics to posts and channels. It has to be something that can continue to evolve and update. And the last part of the question about low-hanging fruit for journalists reporting on misinformation, I think is that the database can hopefully give a better understanding of scale to journalists. I think oftentimes it's difficult when you see misinformation on the internet to know how relevant it is, or to know whether or not it's part of something bigger or it's just one isolated weirdo making a post. And I think that the database could be an important tool for validating whether something is part of a larger trend, whether it's being shared by channels with large number of followers, whether it's relevant in a journalistic context or just more craziness on the internet that we can turn a blind eye to.
Great, and that actually leads very well into my next question for Florian. Florian, I know sort of misinformation stories are covered fairly superficially by journalists, both because kind of the lack of not specialist knowledge and beat reporting on the topic, but also because it can be difficult to pitch a more nuanced story to editors. What's your advice for journalists who want to do a more ambitious story about trends in the misinformation space? How do you get editors on board with these types of stories and give you the time and space to work on these types of stories? And what are you yourself thinking of in terms of, was this a one-off story? Is this something you're going to continue to cover? Are you going to continue to use the database yourself?
So this is a big question. So I think there are two sides of the story. To answer on the dashboard, for example, this is something as I'm still using as of right now to understand and find some trends. For example, when there's a news break in France, for example, I'm trying to see if there's some incidents in the conspiracy spheres in France. As for the broader question, I think the most difficult question to answer when we talk about misinformation and conspiracy theories and disinformation is the actual effect. It's the actual real life effect of what is posted on a network, for example, either by real people or by a bot or by inauthentic account, actually controlled by, for example, another government. Fact checkings are, for example, are really important because they're tools you can use to fight disinformation, and it always feels like trying to remove water from a huge boat with just like tiny, and I forgot what word in English, sorry, but you see the picture. So fact checking, for example, feels like a core, really hopeless chore, but it's really important. But the biggest question we always have to ask is, what's the real life effect of what's this thing? Like, do people have other consequences on people's life? And this is something which requires like human reporting. It requires to dive deep into real life communities, to go into the granular details of these stories. So it also requires a lot of money and time investment.
Thanks, Florian. And for journalists who want to pursue kind of the more ambitious types of stories that you've mentioned about really understanding information flows, getting beyond just, trying to trace a specific incident through the social media space. If you do want to start to do bigger network analysis, Tristan, can you give us some advice on where to get started? Because again, those network graphs, they can be very overwhelming at the beginning. They can be overwhelming both for researchers and for audiences. So where can people turn to if they want sort of some guidance on how to tackle some of those broader network dynamic questions?
Yeah, so I think just a little bit about kind of network visualization. The kind of secret behind these kind of pretty network visualizations is that there's actually a lot of creative choices behind them in terms of, what algorithm to use, parameters to tweak, things like node size, what edges to include. Like, for example, in all those networks I showed, so something that you'll commonly see is that if you have too many edges per node, the network just looks like a hairball, just looks like a big ball of hair. And it's really difficult to see anything in it. So what I did for actually all these visualizations is I used a nice algorithm I found to prune the number of edges to kind of show the network structure better. To one specific question about the directionality of edges, so this is hard. Like in my experience, especially for large network visualizations, it's really difficult to clearly show edge directionality since when there's a lot of edges, the arrows for each edge are really difficult to see. And especially if you're setting edge thickness by the edge weight, it's just difficult to add arrows without it looking really just weird and bad. I'm still working on and thinking about ways of incorporating directionality information. And I guess just to kind of like maybe give some advice on people who want to get started in this, kind of making these visualizations, learning tools like, for example, pandas in Python or its equivalent in RStudio. Just learning kind of basic kind of programming and ways of generating these networks, and also learning how to visualize networks and using tools like Gephi. I use Gephi a lot, and a lot of people do. And so, yeah.
Thanks. And we have a question from the audience from Stella about whether we removed any content. So if there was any either personally identifying information or explicit content that was removed. So Logan, do you want to tell us a little bit about what was included and not included in the database?
Yeah, so the database at this time includes everything that was posted on those channels. So there's no censoring in the database. And for that reason, it could very well include graphic or even illegal content. It could also include personal information about innocent individuals, as Stella mentioned. And that's why we're being perhaps somewhat annoyingly restrictive in how we provide access to the database at this point. That's why if you go to qanon.bellingcat.com, you won't actually find the database, just a form where you can tell us more about who you are and what you want to do with it, because we really want to make sure we're working with researchers that won't just try to crawl through the database for personal information or things like that. It's a tough question in general, and it's something that we've had some spirited debates on internally. It's very difficult to ensure that there's no personally identifying information in a large database like this. And we didn't want to do anything to remove content that might reduce its research value for coming to unbiased conclusions about what kind of data is in the database. And for those reasons, we'll probably never be able to make it public or release it on a wider scale. But we're hopeful that we can still provide access to it to legitimate researchers and journalists that are interested in making use of it in the public interest.
Thank you. And I think one thing to mention that Justin had to leave, but I think he would have mentioned as well is, again, part of the misconception of we build it and they will come. I think it is intimidating at the beginning, especially for journalists without a data journalism background, to use this. So when you fill out the form requesting access, there's an option to let us know if you need help navigating the database, the dashboard itself, or if you want, to do, larger scale research investigations that you might need more complete access to the database. And this for us is not a one-off project. We're happy to have at least initial discussion with you about your research question, about the angle you want to pursue, and try to identify whether we can help you build out the research questions, run some of the queries, and help you with some of the interpretation or analysis. So again, we went through all the effort of putting this together, and so we do really want people to be able to use it. Again, because of the sensitive nature of some of the content, it won't be fully accessible to everyone, but our idea really is to share it for the information and the insights to get out there. I think we've seen just this week in the news with the attack on Nancy Pelosi's husband, there's more and more public interest in really identifying how these conspiracy theories are spreading online, the real world harm that they may be doing, and really inform the policy debate about how the social media space should be policed, and what are the appropriate limits being set. And I really think that a database like this can really ground that conversation and base it in really the insights that we're able to derive live as this database continues to grow, and the social media space continues to evolve. We're running out of our time, but I wanted to remind everybody that the sessions for both days have been recorded, and we're going to be publishing the recordings of the sessions. And again, both the Lighthouse and the Bellingcat team are available for consultations for how you can use the database, and we've shared the link to the form for all of you to fill out, and we look forward to seeing the products that come out of your research. I'd like to thank all the panelists, and not only for joining the panel, but all of the really hard work that you've put in to making the database possible and making these stories part of the conversation and public debate about the QAnon space in Europe. So thank you very much, and enjoy your evenings. Bye-bye.